In November of 1888, a rather disturbing scene emerged as a large, angry crowd assembled outside the city jail in Glen Falls, New York. A young man of some notoriety had been arrested for a very serious crime, and the police struggled to protect him from the mob. During the attempt to protect the prisoner, a police officer's weapon discharged accidentally and struck the young man in the right side of the neck. The young man writhed in pain before being taken to the nearest medical facility for treatment. The young man wounded that night, John W. Glenn, was born in January 1850 and played 6 years in the major leagues, splitting time at first base and the outfield for Washington in the old National Association, the forerunner to the National League, playing for the Washington Nationals in 1870, the Washington Olympics in 1871 and 72, the Washington Nationals again in 1872, the Washington Blue Legs in 1873, and the Chicago White Stockings from 1874 to 1877. On November 7, 1877, Glenn was arrested in Sandy Hill, New York for the rape and robbery of 12-year-old Helen Sherrill. Once word got out that the police had a child molester in custody, as history has proven, the wheels of justice do not spin fast enough for the likings of a large, maddened crowd. The accidental discharge of the police officer's weapon cheated whatever justice may have awaited the accused, as Glenn succumbed to his wound on Saturday, November 10th, and a coroner's inquiry conducted on that morning determined that Glenn died from a gunshot wound that pierced his brain. Witnesses at the scene of the time of the shooting testified later at a legal proceeding that once police took Glenn into custody, one police officer, obviously dedicated to his charge, stated to the crowd that, quote, "He is my prisoner and I will protect him," end quote. As the officer said this, his weapon discharged and the witness continued that Glenn fell to the floor. Authorities later learned that Glenn had recently been released from a jail in the West for assaulting a woman, and as little as 2 years before the attack on Helen Sherrill, he attacked his own niece. To most, the police sworn to protect Glenn actually performed a great service to the community. Glenn will be remembered as someone with a history of violence toward women and children who deserved the fate he received, no matter his notoriety. On January 1st, 1890, New York police received a call from residents of a rundown neighborhood who had not heard from Ellen Slocum, a young woman who was married to a former professional baseball player, James Slocum. Mrs. Alice Keneally notified the police, and once they arrived, they noted that the door to her tiny apartment locked. Breaking down the door, police officers discovered the brutally beaten body of Ellen Slocum. Mrs. Slocum's face was disfigured and covered in blood. Her skull appeared to have been broken into pieces. A bloody axe lay beside Ellen Slocum with pieces of her hair attached in bloody clumps on the blunt end of the weapon. Neighbors heard the blows and her screaming for life. Not one of the neighbors went to the couple's apartment to investigate the disturbance. James Slocum, a former professional baseball player, was born in New York City in 1868. Slocum played with the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania team and with the New Haven Nine, where he played catcher. Ellen and Slocum were married while he was still a baseball player, and after his retirement from the game, had trouble securing work and drifted into a life of crime and debauchery. Several times he beat his wife so badly that she could not show her face in public. 4 years before the death of his wife, Slocum went to prison for stealing a man's watch. After authorities took note of the crime scene, they notified Ellen's family of what occurred. Her father, Mr. Patrick Perkins, aided the police to find the fugitive. With the help of the grieving father, police traced Slocum to another part of New York and discovered that he made his way back to the seedy neighborhood he once inhabited with his dead wife. A detective dressed like a hobo, quote, hired a bed in the rickety old building, end quote, that Slocum inhabited. The detective kept close watch on the entrances and exits on the building, and on the night of January 19, 1890, police officers busted open the door to his room, but did not find their quarry in his bed. Instead, they noticed a pair of legs sticking out of the skylight on the ceiling. Slocum had been warned that the police were looking for him. Slocum then pulled his legs through the skylight, and a late-night chase ensued over the rooftops of New York City. When Slocum reached a fire escape on one of the rooftops, He climbed down as far as he could go until he reached a point of approximately 23 feet from the ground. Slocum jumped and appeared unhurt, disappearing over the fence of 109 Greenwich Street. From there, police lost their suspect, but one observant officer noticed the wet footprints leaving the yard and followed them to a barn not too far away. There, they found the suspect hiding under a pile of hay and immediately took Slocum into custody. After careful investigation, authorities determined on December 31, 1889, Slocum returned to the home that he shared with his wife Ella at 114 Roosevelt Street, a cheap lodging house where he shared a, quote, dirty, scantily furnished room, end quote. Ellen did not appear to be home. Then Slocum went to the room of a neighbor and found his wife in the company of John Williams, a man that locals referred to as, quote, Greek John, end quote. Slocum then grabbed his wife and proceeded to beat her. He then dragged her to the couple's room and continued the violence. Authorities surmised that Slocum became frenzied with the sight of blood and in a coup de grace beat his helpless wife with the blunt end of a hatchet with the final blow into the side of her head, bringing death. With the ferocity of the beating, a large pool of blood puddled on the floor. From all indications, it appeared that Slocum dragged his wife from the floor to the bed, covered her with a blanket so that anyone entered the room would believe Ellen was sleeping. Then Slocum fled. After his capture, Slocum stood before the court in late 1890. They convicted him of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death by electrocution. Of course, Slocum's case went through the appeal process until finally his execution date was set for the week of July 5, 1891. On July 7, 1891, Slocum was slated to be executed first at New York's Sing Sing prison. At 4:31 a.m., prison guards escorted Slocum to the death chamber, his head and ankles slightly shaved to accept the fatal charges through the electrodes. Once seated in the electric chair, prison guards fastened the restraints to hold the prisoner in the chair, attaching the electrode to his head and his ankles, and then backed away, as Warden W.R. Brown read the decree of the state. When asked if he had any last words, Slocum just nodded his head in the negative. At 4:33 a.m., the executioner pressed the one button that sent the electricity through the prisoner's body. The first jolt of 27 seconds did not stop his heart or breathing. Thus, another jolt of 26 seconds was applied and this stopped the heart and respiration. Guards allowed Slocum's body to cool and wait for the prison doctor to pronounce death. The doctor declared Slocum dead at 4:42 a.m. His body was removed from the death chamber at 5 a.m. and later buried in a prison cemetery on the following day. On a lovely spring afternoon on March 2, 1901, at approximately 12:01 p.m., Ruth Nollard, a 19-year-old beauty, walked home with her younger sister Louise along West 9th Street in Kansas City, Missouri. Although the young females sauntered along the street, drawing the glances of young men passing them, the pleasant air broke with the sounds of 3 gunshots. Spectators noticed that firing came from a second-floor window of a rooming house owned by John Merkel. Louise stated that she and Ruth walked toward Hank Street when a shot rang out and Ruth staggered. Louise continued that a second shot rang out and the younger sister threw her arms around her wounded sister. Quote, "I tried to hold her up, but I could not and had to let her go," end quote. A doctor happened by, Dr. W.P. King, and along with several young men transported Ruth to C.G. Young's drugstore at 9th and Washington Streets, where she lay on a counter. When asked who may have shot her, Ruth responded, quote, "I don't know, but it wasn't Bud," end quote. Ruth breathed her last at approximately 1:08 p.m. Dr. King then summoned the coroner. After the confusion ended and police combed the neighborhood, 2 residents from the Merkel rooming house, H.B. Garrett and M. Winters, directed police to a man who rented a second-floor room in the house, 23-year-old John Bud Taylor, who was seen hiding in a back room. Taylor, a minor league ball player, made quite a reputation for himself as an infielder with Nebraska in 1899, and the next season played for a semi-professional team in the East. When police arrived at the Merkel rooming house, Detective Ed Boyle, armed with a rifle, immediately went to the room where Taylor was believed to be hiding. Easily finding Taylor, police arrested him without hesitation. As police escorted the suspected murderer from the rooming house, a crowd quickly gathered outside and threatened to lynch the ball player. Rumors quickly spread that the suspect had escaped, but the police, in an attempt to avoid any confrontations with the crowd, sneaked Taylor through a wholesale drugstore. Taylor exhibited some bravado, but when he saw the crowd that had grown substantially, he cowered between the two large police officers with eyes that begged for protection. Finally, the officers drew their weapons in order to keep the lynch mob at bay until the suspect could be quickly skirted away. Even after Taylor entered the paddy wagon headed to the station, the mob followed, and as they approached the station, authorities noted that each block passed had a larger crowd waiting for them than the one before. Not long after police brought Taylor in for questioning, he sat stoically for a few minutes and handed the officers his personal property for safekeeping. When they tried to take the photo of Ruth from Taylor's pocket, he cried to them, quote, "For God's sake, don't take that picture," end quote. Taylor also handed over a photograph of himself, which seemed that Taylor wrote somewhat of a farewell note to his mother. It stated, quote, "My dear mother, please forgive me for this, for I am willing to die for the one I love. The girl had treated me very bad. Bud Taylor," end quote. On the back of Ruth's photograph, the police found written the words,
"I love you, Bud Taylor, and I will marry no other man. I will have you or not marry at all."
As the police searched Taylor and cataloged his belongings, a large crowd assembled outside of the city hall containing police headquarters, and they demanded entrance. Police all over the station were dispatched to defend the seat of local government from turning into a full-fledged riot. The available officers covered every entrance, but the police chief, John Hayes, seeing that perhaps the crowd may overcome his officers, secreted Taylor to an undisclosed location. Actually, it was just a cell on the other side of the jailhouse where very few prisoners were housed. Chief Hayes spoke with Taylor when the suspect then confessed, quote, "I loved her, and I was not willing to live without her," end quote. Chief Hayes then interrogated Taylor further. It seemed that the suspect felt at ease with the lawman, and when Chief Hayes asked Taylor when the young man determined to kill the woman he loved, Taylor responded, quote, "Oh, I don't know. She threatened to kill me one night at the skating rink when I was talking to a young lady. Threatened to kill me or blind me," end quote. Taylor continued that he purchased the rifle used at a pawn shop for $7. Bud Taylor experienced great distress after Ruth ended their romance upon learning that Taylor was married with a small child. After ending the affair with Taylor, Ruth resumed a romance with a former lover. Even after their romance, Taylor continued to, quote, "shadow," end quote, Ruth, what today would be known as a stalker, as he once hit her and 2 weeks before murdering his former lover, choked her until she agreed to marry him. On 2 occasions, police warrants were issued, but the district attorney in Missouri refused to prosecute. In fact, Taylor's wife saw the violent side of her husband and left him after he choked her. Taylor waited nearly 3 days for his chance to assassinate his former lover. 2 weeks prior to the murder, Taylor snuck into the Nollard household on a Sunday morning. Louise and Ruth fought Taylor off, and their father, Jake Nollard, suffered a severe cut on his hand, but between the 3 of them, they managed to chase Taylor from the house. On March 4, 1901, a coroner's jury gathered to examine the evidence against Taylor for first-degree murder. Prior to the start of the proceeding, the jurists conducting the coroner's jury received word that Taylor tried to kill himself within his cell. The jurist reported that, quote, he, Taylor, attached one end of a clothesline, which was hanging in his cell, to the ceiling and placed his head through the noose on the other end, end quote. William Keats, Taylor's cellmate, quickly awoke and caught Taylor attempting to jump off his bunk. A struggle ensued between the 2 cellmates, and the correctional officers at the jail hastily made their way to the cell, separating the 2 men and restraining Taylor. Some believed that Taylor's actions were an attempt to garner public sympathy for the suspect. Represented by former State Attorney General L.C. Boyle, Taylor pled not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge set his trial for April 29, 1901. On April 23, 1901, the court determined that Taylor exhibited no signs of insanity and would face justice in front of Judge Samuel Davis. Although several continuances plagued the system on Taylor's behalf, on October 5, 1901, after all evidence had been considered, the jury deliberated for 55 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty against Taylor. But evidence demonstrated that Taylor suffered from epilepsy a condition which defense attorney Boyle would use as grounds for an appeal. On October 11, 1902, the Missouri Supreme Court heard the case of State versus Taylor. They denied the appeal. On April 18, 1903, jailers walked Taylor slowly to the gallows in Kansas City, Missouri. As he approached the steps to meet the hangman, Taylor's brother stood off to the side. Taylor handed him a small envelope of strychnine. Taylor possessed the envelope for several months, but converted to Catholicism and changed his mind on committing suicide. At 12:03 p.m., the hangman executed young Taylor. The lover breathed no more. Born Daniel Charles Shea on November 8, 1876 in Springfield, Ohio, the young Danny demonstrated an affinity for sports at a very early age. If any trait would have been considered detrimental, it was Shea's short temper. Springfield, Ohio appealed diverse, in fact more welcoming of outsiders more than other cities of their size or that time. Racial tensions permeated the landscape as the competition for jobs in the small town reached a fever pitch, and black settlers from Kentucky had pervaded the state in the wake of the American Civil War, and blacks soon outnumbered whites, which presented racial disharmony. Most of the schools were integrated, and Shea, in addition to his athletic prowess, also exhibited virulent racism due to his experiences as a youth and the prejudice that his Irish parents demonstrated against blacks in Ohio. In 1895, Shea left Ohio to start his career in baseball. In 1897, he first appeared with 3 teams in the Interstate League and the Ohio West Virginia League. Because of the scarcity of records, we know that in 1899, Shea hit .288 in a total of 100 games with 4 minor league teams. His temper got the better of him, and in 1900, while playing for the Youngstown, Pennsylvania Little Giants, Shea had to pay a fine for leaving the team and the use of improper language. In 1901, Shea played for the Cleveland Blues, and during the 1902 season, he hit .239 in 167 games. After leaving St. Paul for another team, the police arrested Shea for the failure to pay a hotel bill. When brought before the magistrate, Shea agreed to pay a $25 fine in addition to the $138 for the outstanding debt. When Shea played for the San Francisco Seals in 1903, he had batted .243 in 167 games. In late 1903, the Detroit Tigers expressed an interest in signing Shea to the team. In the spring of 1904, he began training with the St. Louis Cardinals. He played 99 games for the Cardinals in 1904. In the 1905 season, Shea suffered an injury to a pinky finger. It did not heal well, and doctors recommended amputation. Because of the removal of that digit, Shea sat out the 1906 season. While Shea was managing at Kansas City in early 1910, American Association President Thomas Shivington imposed new conduct rules for the league. The new system emphasized fines for players and managers rather than simply ejecting them when they behaved poorly. After Shea was ejected from 3 games in a 4-game span, a Minnesota newspaper article questioned whether his behavior would be subject to additional disciplinary action. The next month, Shea released 48-year-old Jake Beckley, prompting his retirement after one of the longest careers in professional baseball history. The first baseman had tried to make the Kansas City team after 20 years in the National League. In March 1911, Shea was riding in a taxi that collided with a dray, and he sustained severe cuts to his face. A newspaper report said that Shea might miss a portion of spring training. Shea was suspended indefinitely in late June 1911 after a fight with an umpire. In October 1911, Shea abruptly resigned as the manager in Kansas City. He declined to say what prompted his resignation and said that he might not be permanently finished with baseball, but he said that he was finished with the Kansas City club. When asked about the possibility of a major league managing job, Shea responded, quote, "There is nothing to be said now, but there may be something later," end quote. Shea was married with 2 children. He had managed the 1913 Helena Senators in a minor league known as the Union Association, but his wife was killed in a car accident in 1914, and their children were sent to live with relatives. Shea sat out of baseball that year. In early 1915, newspaper reports held that Shea was headed to Havana to sell real estate. He had apparently grown tired of professional baseball. However, Kansas City manager Bill Armour was promoted to vice president in April 1915, and the team rehired Shea as its manager. Shea cultivated an image as a brash character. A 1915 article in the Oakland Tribune said he had, quote, more pep than perhaps any other laddie who ever wore a spiked shoe, end quote. The article recalled an incident from his playing days with Stockton in which he had poked an umpire in the nose. It said that when he left Stockton, he had, quote, carried all of his pep with him, and he is almost as well known in the East as he is in and around this section, end quote. Late in the 1916 season, Shea was dismissed as manager. He had not been on the bench recently, and his absence was attributed to poor health. Art Phelan, who had been managing the team on an interim basis, was named as Shea's replacement for the rest of the season. Signed to manage the Milwaukee Brewers of the American Association in 1917, Shea had a clause in his contract prohibiting him from drinking alcohol, though he was still known to visit bars and order Dubonnet, a liquor that Shea said was, quote, soft as a milkshake, end quote. Shea's predecessor in Milwaukee, Harry Pep Clark, resigned in the middle of the 1916 season. Clark had led the team to league championships in 1913 and 1914, but he experienced difficulty by the next year when the club's ownership refused to sign new players to replace aging veterans. In 1917, Shea brought the team he was managing, the Milwaukee Brewers, to Indianapolis where his team hoped to improve their record. On the evening of May 3rd of that year, Shea entered the English Hotel with 36-year-old Gertrude Anderson for a night of dinner and drinks. When Miss Anderson entered the hotel lobby, she looked around at the waitstaff and the bellman waiting for their charges to arrive. The twice-divorced woman looked into the direction of a black waiter, Clarence Buell, and noticed that he leered at her. When Anderson and Shea entered the restaurant, Anderson notified her escort as to what she observed. Shea began drinking earlier that day, and by the time the couple sat down for a meal at the English Hotel, his mind wandered, and he called Ewell over to the table and asked for some sugar. After several bowls of sugar later, Shea and Ewell began arguing. Ewell seemed to get the better of Shea, and Shea pulled a revolver from his back pocket. Shea fired one shot into Ewell's chest. Anderson ran from the restaurant to the kitchen, and authorities found her 2 days later. Ewell died within the hour. After the management of the hotel called the police, when they arrived, they arrested Shea for Ewell's murder. During his trial, which took place 6 months later, on November 12, 1917, witnesses stepped forward to testify that Ewell was neither abusive or rude to Shea during the entire incident. After Ewell sustained the gunshot wound, he commenced to beat Shea to a pulp, and when asked to stop, Ewell responded that, quote, why shouldn't I kill him? He shot me to death inside. I haven't got a chance to live, end quote. Another witness testified that she overheard Shea and Ewell and stated that Ewell balked at Shea's request for sugar and, in an effort that seemed very sarcastic in nature, put 2 more bowls of sugar in front of the drunk Shea. Gertrude Anderson testified that Ewell was very rude and argumentative towards them and eventually swore at Shea before lunging at the drunk man. Shea took the stand in his own defense and denied he was drunk and claimed self-defense. The defense rested, and the jury received the case for deliberation on November 21, 1917, at 11 p.m. At 9 a.m. the next morning, the jury reached a verdict. They found Shea not guilty. On November 23, 1917, an editorial appeared in the Milwaukee Sentinel chastising Shea for his actions. Daniel Shea, of course he had no right even to carry a revolver. That act itself was a violation of law. But having it, he had no right to it unless he had good reason to believe that his life was in danger. The only testimony that even tends to sustain that theory was his own. On Wednesday, November 30th, 1927, police arrived at a local hotel to investigate a disturbance. When they arrived, they found Daniel Shea, 50, lying dead on the floor from a gunshot wound behind the right ear. The weapon lay on the floor near his right hand. Shea had disappeared from the headlines after his acquittal and out of the thinking of local and national press. During that period, he suffered a series of strokes that left his right side slightly paralyzed. Therefore, how could he have carefully placed a bullet behind his right ear? Later examination revealed that the head wound was one of 2. How does a man who suffered a series of strokes in the very hand where police found the weapon pull the trigger twice to his own head? The case remains unsolved, even to this day. Crimes against children are never easy to discuss, but one must remember that sports figures are human beings that are tempted by whatever proclivity. This particular desire has lately become the topic of a lot of conversation. But in 1911, this topic rarely saw any mention in local newspapers, but left the details to the imagination. William Farmer Weaver was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia on March 23, 1877. He made his Major League Baseball debut in 1888 with the Louisville Colonels and later played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Weaver only played 6 seasons between 1888 and 1894, but posted better than average numbers during his career with a .278 batting average, 856 hits in 751 games, along with 162 stolen bases. In 1883, Weaver married Dora Dove Dye. He was 18, and allegedly she was 14 or 15 years old at the time of their nuptials. And by 1904, they separated. Dora charged Weaver with physical cruelty, while Weaver charged infidelity and desertion. During the period that they filed charges against each other, Dora requested custody of an orphan, Cecile Price, who everyone called Hazel Weaver, aged 9. Sometime in 1910, Cecile became pregnant. Cecile knew that unwed mothers did not garner much respect in those days, and faced with a difficult decision, Cecile went to the authorities and told them when she reached 11 years old, Weaver began abusing the girl, later impregnating her at the age of 17. After hearing the girl's story, police charged Weaver and later arrested him for statutory rape. After receiving bail, Weaver then fled. Residing in Mexico for a short time, Weaver then crossed the border into Texas, where authorities captured the fugitive. Placed on trial in March of 1912 in the Pawnee County Courthouse, Weaver pled guilty and the court sentenced him to 5 to 20 years. For 2 years, from 1912 to 1914, Weaver lived as a guest of the Kansas State Penitentiary. In late December of that year, 2 former teammates, the governor and his executive secretary, made sure that Weaver received a Christmas clemency. Weaver later left Kansas and then settled in Ohio, where he worked for the Goodyear Tire Company, where he lived alone. Weaver died in 1943 of heart failure. He had no heirs. In order to get some insight on what a player's life was like in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I engaged an historian, another historian, a baseball historian, who is the foremost authority, I believe, on baseball history in the United States. Now, there is a connection between this historian and myself. He happens to be my older brother, my only brother, Jay Gautreaux, who has written a bunch of articles on baseball history, and I decided that I would ask him a few questions, but I also gave him a test in case there were some doubting Thomases in the audience.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Oh, buy me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today one of the foremost baseball historians on the planet, and he also happens to be my brother, Mr. Jay Gautreaux. How you doing today, brother?
I'm doing fine, sir. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm doing great. Listen, I got a couple of questions that I want to present to you. You know, you helped me do the research on some of these cases that we presented in Black Diamond earlier. And right. I was wondering if you could tell me, what was the status of baseball players as far as society was concerned when the sport was relatively new?
The ball players were pretty much like actors. And by that I mean is that actors went from town to town, so did ball players. All right, let's say that you're a ball player and you're in Ottumwa, Iowa, and you have to go someplace like in Van Meter. I mean, it could take a couple of days, so during that length of time, you were pretty much on the road, and you had time to kill, so to speak. Enough time to get in trouble, or enough time to find something that was legit to do.
Okay, we profiled Daniel Shea. Daniel Shea was a baseball player that shot a black man in
1917.
1917, that's correct. And he was a baseball player that had a lot of trouble, from what I understand, because of his temper and also because of racism. Now, was racism prevalent in the leagues back then?
It was pretty much part of the atmosphere during that time, because of the Jim Crow laws. I mean, the black man was not supposed to acknowledge or say hi to a white woman. Daniel Shea was a red-hot tempered Irishman who took exception to that, and one thing led to another, and he shot and killed him. Mm-hmm.
Now, was Daniel Shea a good ball player?
I would say he was about average. He was a good glove man. He could handle himself with the bat, so to speak. Played for John McGraw, and it's like when you play for John McGraw, your game is pretty much elevated, to play exceptionally well.
Okay.
Because John McGraw didn't really allow any kind of errors.
Do you think that a lot of the baseball players, as I know some of them now, athletes, star athletes, did they think that they were above the law back then?
Probably with the size of their egos. They probably thought they were above the law.
Do you think that the attitude of athletes, as far as some of them doing what they want and getting away with it, do you think it's still prevalent today?
I think that with the salaries the way it is now, Pete Rose thought he was bigger than the game itself. Mm-hmm. Okay, but Bart Giamatti brought him down. Right. You have ball players who think that they're above it all, but they're no different than you and I. By that I mean is that the pay may be bigger, but they're still the same person.
Now, last time we talked, you talked about this rule, this golden rule. We talked about Shoeless Joe Jackson. We talked about Pete Rose. Can you explain for our audience what that rule is?
Years ago, I talked to Mel Parnell, former Boston Red Sox lefty, and the subject got on, of course, Pete Rose. He told me and several others who were with him at the time that in every single major league ballpark locker room, every minor league, every spring training locker room, there is a sign. Rule number 21, you do not bet on baseball. In spring training, that is ingrained in their thoughts. You do not bet on baseball.
Do you think that Shoeless Joe Jackson and or Pete Rose will ever get into the Baseball Hall of Fame? And why or why not?
I don't think so. You see, 40 years ago when I read the book by Donald Groatman about Shoeless Joe Jackson, I felt sympathetic towards him. But then as you age and you pick up a little bit more wisdom about it, kind of changes your perception to where, okay, he was guilty. He did have knowledge of it, but he didn't do anything. And, the fact that he had, the Shoeless Joe Jackson batted .375 in the series kind of makes you wonder, did he go by the script? But I don't think he should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't even think Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame.
I kind of tend to agree with that. You look at Shoeless Joe Jackson. Was Shoeless Joe Jackson, did he come from, poverty?
Well, he came from the mill town of Brandon Mills, South Carolina.
Okay.
Okay, his education was limited.
He didn't know how to read and write, did he?
I don't believe he did.
Okay.
I do know his wife taught him how to write his name. And I think like any time he had to sign a contract, he would put what was pretty much the accepted standard of the day, and that is to write an X. But he didn't know how to read or write, and he just knew how to play baseball.
Now, I want to give you a little test for the audience, okay? You ready? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a series of questions about baseball history, and I want you to tell the audience the answer. All right, you ready?
All right, let's go.
Okay. Who won the 1905 World Series?
New York Giants, 4-1. Every game was a shutout.
All right.
The big star of that game was Christy Mathewson, who pitched 3 games, all shutouts.
Okay, who was the losing pitcher?
Chief Bender, I believe, Andy Coakley.
Okay. 1912 World Series.
The Boston Red Sox. I believe they won in 8 games. 1 game, I believe, was tied when they called it.
Okay. Winning pitcher?
Smokey Joe Wood.
Okay. Was there a batting champion?
I could think of several.
Okay.
Let's see, Tris Speaker was one.
Okay.
Harry Hooper, his teammate.
Last one. You ready?
Go for it.
All right. Do you think the Chicago White Sox could have won the 1919 World Series?
I would say yes. Because even though they won 88 ball games that year, and their opponent, Cincinnati, won 96, I think that they had everything together to win. But with history as itself, we'll never know.
Your opinion. Greatest long ball hitter in the history of the game?
Babe Ruth.
Babe Ruth. Okay, nobody comes close.
No one.
Well, listen, Jay, I want to thank you. It's always a pleasure. I'm sure the audience will enjoy this conversation. Okay?
Good.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd.
I'd like to thank Jay for being on the program. He's very smart. He's my only brother. He lives in Memphis, Tennessee. Goes to watch the Memphis Redbirds a lot. We used to go watch games down here when the New Orleans Zephyrs played at UNO Field before then. I'll be returning to the regular type of programming. I just thought this was a pretty interesting topic to cover, and I wanted to include my brother in it because it's not often that he gets recognized for some of the things that he knows and some of the things that he accomplishes. So until next time, I'll see you on True Crime, Man's Dark Imagination. Have a great summer.
I have been around this world a lot, saw every part, and I have only found one girl for me in Japanese.